In the last video, we have discussed what kind of database API we want to build, and we have talked about data models. And the next thing that we need to clarify is where we are going to add the database service class inside our widget tree, so that it is available for widgets that may need it. So the widget tree that we have created up to this point looks like this. And for our next step, we are going to replace the home page with a jobs page, which is represented in this diagram. And there are a few interesting things to notice here. The first one is that I've added a provider widget above the jobs page. And the purpose of this is to make the database object available to the jobs page. Now, this might seem like a strange decision because when we added the authentication provider, we agreed that it was best to add a provider widget above the material app so that this entire widget subtree could get access to the auth object. However, in this case, I think it's best to only create the database provider as a child of the landing page. And the reason for this is that when we create the jobs page, we know the current user ID of the signed in user. So why is this important? Well, one requirement that we have kind of neglected up to this point is that all the operations that we have listed over here are specific for the user that is currently signed in. In other words, unless we are signed in, we shouldn't be able to perform any of these operations, and the landing page that we have already created makes sure that we only ever reach the home page after we sign in. So what this means from a database point of view is that users should only be able to see their own data. And if you remember, when we talked about documents and collections, we have used this specific path as an example of where we may store jobs in Firestore. So the point that I'm trying to drive home here is that for each user, we are going to store a collection of jobs using a path like this. And the user ID that we see over here is exactly the user ID that is returned by Firebase authentication when we sign in. So I'm going to say this again because I think this is a golden rule when working with Firebase authentication and Cloud Firestore. The user ID that is returned by Firebase authentication is the user ID that we use in Cloud Firestore. So if you want to store data that is user specific, make sure that you store it inside a path that contains the user ID from Firebase authentication. And the implication of this is that we can write some specific rules to only allow reads and writes in Firestore if the user ID that we specify matches the user ID of the authenticated user. So if we go back to our widget tree, our choice to add a database provider as a child of the landing page makes sense because it means that we can pass the user ID to the constructor of the database class, and we will need that user ID every time we make a call to any of the methods inside our database class. Okay, so now that we have clarified this, we have all the ingredients that we need to start writing some code. So let's continue on the next video.